My grandmother only found out right before she died, right before her 96th birthday, what happened to her own mother, because she had to leave in the middle of the night without saying goodbye. So none of my great-grandparents actually made it into any camps. They were killed immediately right on the street.
I'm a little nervous about going to Auschwitz. Auschwitz seems to be the quintessential Holocaust experience. For those of us who don't have family stories, we've read Night. Elie Wiesel talks about Auschwitz. That seems to be what everybody thinks about when they think about the Holocaust. And I'm a little nervous about experiencing that personally.
In 1941, as the Nazis decide on the final solution, they pick this location to be the center for the murder of European Jewry. 1.3 million people arrived. 1.1 million people were killed. Of those 1.1 million, 1 million, about 90%, were Jews. In 1942 and 43, Jews arrived here at what was called the Judenrampe. And they arrived here and they were marched to the camp more or less on the route that we're going to walk. It was only in the beginning of 1944 that the Nazis decide to improve the system, quote unquote, make it more efficient, and they don't build, they have slave laborers build railroad tracks that go straight into the camp, straight into Birkenau. And we'll see those railway tracks. Why do they do that? Not just to improve the system in general, because they're planning a massive deportation of Hungarian Jews. In March 1944, Germany invades Hungary. And they begin to gather the Jews. And they put them in ghettos. And shortly thereafter, beginning in May 44, over a period of about 10 weeks, May, June, early July, about 400,000 Hungarian Jews are brought to Birkenau. The vast majority of them are killed on arrival. Initially, the Nazi plan was to murder all the Jews who came, just like at Treblinka, just like in Operation Reinhardt. But because the tide of the war turns, and they have real needs for the war effort, they begin to do selections. People would be unloaded, and actually, here we can see the photograph. They're told to leave their bags, all their belongings. People are organized first by gender. Men on one side, women and children under the age of 14 on the other side. They're organized by fives, easy to count. 5, 10, 15. And here you could see they're lined up. Again, you see the iconic guard tower in the background. Right around over here in the middle of the tracks are sitting SS doctors, including but not only Dr. Yosef Mengele. Mengele was the one who also performed experiments on twins. There were more than 200,000 Jewish children brought here. Of them, only a tiny number survived, and many of those who survived because they underwent terrible experiments by Dr. Mengele. In any case, the SS doctors are there, and as people go by, they're making the selection. Who's fit for work? Who's not fit for work? Whoever's not fit for work is going to go to the gas chambers. In that sense, this is a death camp. Whoever's going to work, that makes this a slave labor camp. Now, on average, Let's say about 80% of those who arrive are sent immediately to be gassed. Certainly, women with young children, the elderly, the infirm. However, depending on the labor needs, sometimes you might have a transport where the percentage who are sent immediately to their death is much less. Or, if the camp is full and there aren't great needs, 100% of the people, even those who are fit for work, could be sent immediately to be gassed. It depended on the needs that they had for slave labor. Of the 20% who are sent to work, the average life expectancy was about 90 days for women and about 6 months for men. Take a look at what people are wearing. What are they wearing? They're wearing winter coats. In June of 1944. Why are they wearing winter coats? They're told you can take one suitcase. They had the Jews select their most valuable items for them. Had they told them you can't take anything, they'd have to rummage through the entire house. This way they let the Jews rummage through the entire house and take what was most valuable. If you would pack your winter coat in your suitcase, it would take up all the space. So you wore your winter coat even if it was June. But wait a minute. If you wore your winter coat, what does that mean?
So you're going to go in the winter.
My sense is that there were some people who knew and believed the stories, that a very large percentage of people didn't know. The percentage of women who are killed is higher than the percentage of men because of the children. You have many able-bodied women in their 20s and 30s who have small children. If they were not with their children, they might have been sent to slave labor, but with their children, they're sent directly to the gas chambers. We've been following the route of those who were not sentenced immediately to death, but sentenced to slave labor. We talked about the average life expectancy. And I mentioned that, the later you arrived in the camp, more likely you were to survive. My mother-in-law was brought here in one of the last transports from the Lodz ghetto. One reason why she survives, I mentioned she also had an iron will. But there was another reason too. She made undergarments for the wives of the SS men, and that was an indoor job. If you worked indoors, your chances of survival skyrocketed. Because imagine working outdoors. Today's not a particularly hot day. Imagine doing hard physical labor without having the option of drinking water. Imagine what it's like in the winter if you have an outdoor job, which is what most people had. And then, of course, the two most prized jobs in the camp were to work in the kitchen or here in Canada. This is the warehouse area. The belongings of the new arrivals were all brought here. There might have been food. There might have been some item you could barter for food. You could trade. Of course, anything you would take would be at the risk of a beating or even your life. But people did manage to get away with things, and that would keep them alive. Rudolf Verba writes that when he came to Canada, he saw mountains of pots and pans. And he describes them as from a million kitchens. And then he sees a tremendous pile of baby carriages. Describes them, some of them were brand new for a newborn, and some of them were tried and true and had been handed down from child to child. He said he saw the baby carriages and he wondered, where are the babies? So this is the building that the prisoners called the sauna. Just as Canada was not Canada, the sauna was not a sauna. But the newly arrived prisoners would come here for processing into the camp. And this is where prisoners undressed.
I think when you think about this room, people leaving their stuff behind, not only is it a humiliating experience, but it's actually, of course, an experience that robs you of your identity and of your past.
Particularly women, once their hair was cut off, they were unrecognizable even to people who knew them well. And of course, this is also where tattoos were applied. So this is, talk about the loss of identity. For a woman to have to shave her head, or have her head shaved, better yet, and for a man or woman to have a number instead of their name, this is like the conclusion of the loss of identity that begins earlier on when you lose your profession, when you lose your property, you lose your home, you're separated from your family perhaps. Those are all issues of a loss of identity, and this is the culmination of that. Five gas chambers and crematoria. There were 4 here in Birkenau. And the 4 here in Birkenau were much larger than the one in Auschwitz I. We already saw number 4 and 5 from a distance, crematoria 4 and 5. Each of those had a capacity of 800 people. But the biggest of all the gas chambers and crematoria that the Nazis built is the one you're looking at, and its twin on the other side. Crematoria 2 and 3, as they're called here. These gas chambers could murder 1,500 people at a time each. We're now following the route of the Jews who are taken here to be killed immediately, the 80% on average. From the Rampa, from where the selection takes place, they're brought to one of these crematoria, a 3-story building. We'll see pictures of it. This is the basement. There was a ground level, and there's another level on top. So what we're looking at is the basement of a building. The building looks pretty nondescript. If I didn't tell you you were in Birkenau, you'd see it and you might call it a bakery. You might call it something else. You wouldn't know what it is. The prisoners are brought down the steps. Of course, it means that this is totally underground. It means it's totally soundproof. And this large area that we're seeing right in front of us, this is where people undressed. The murder took place using Zyklone B. Zyklone B is a form of cyanide. It comes in the form of crystals. In the form of crystals, it's not as dangerous. But if you heat the crystals to a certain temperature, the crystals evaporate. And those fumes are what are asphyxiating. So what the Germans have to do is create a situation where the temperature in the room is going to be high enough for the Zyklone B crystals to evaporate. And if you put enough people into a room with a low ceiling and you pack them in closely with their body temperature 98.6, you create enough heat. And after a few minutes it would begin to evaporate and people would literally choke to death. After everybody inside was dead, the area was ventilated by the Sonderkommando, the Jews who worked here in the crematoria. And on the ground floor, there were 15 oven openings, 5 ovens with 3 openings each. And there the Sonderkommando would burn the bodies. Shlomo Godowski writes, he was once working here, and they were the ones to help the people into the changing room and to supervise their undressing. He said that once he greeted his aunt as she was entering the changing room. He recognized her. He said, I didn't know whether to tell her or not, because she didn't seem to know what fate awaited her.
Yitbarach, Vishtabach, Vizpar, Vitroma, Vitnaseh, Vitadar, Vitaleh, Vitalal, Shmei,
יש לנו רבה משנה, חיים בימינו, כל ישראל וימינו. שלום, שלום, שלום.
Barracks like this would usually hold about 500 prisoners, but sometimes more. The average amount of space that one had on a bed, if you want to call them beds, was about 1 square meter a person. So you can imagine that you might have 5 or 6 people sleeping in one bed. Of course, there was one advantage to that, and that in the winter, when it was cold, because even though you see chimneys here and there was a heating system, it was not warm in the barracks. So that's the one advantage, but you can imagine the many disadvantages of being so close up with people, some of whom you may not have known. People didn't smell very good. We'll talk a little more of that later. Everybody was filthy. Everybody was hungry. There's a story that Rudolf Verba tells about what he calls the stock exchange of hell. He describes a Dutch Jew who is a newcomer to the camp and who somehow managed to bring in with him a small leather pouch with diamonds. And Rudolf Verba describes how he goes over to the capo and he gives him this pouch of diamonds, and he describes how when the diamonds come out of that pouch, they're like illuminated from all directions like 1,000 suns. And he gives them to the capo, and in exchange the capo gives him 3 raw potatoes. Rudolf Verba calls this the stock exchange of hell, where the diamonds, he said, were actually worth less than the 3 uncooked potatoes. Because the diamonds couldn't help you live, the 3 uncooked potatoes might get you through another day. Other survivors described the planet Auschwitz. A different planet. Of course, you could have said the same probably about almost every one of the camps. It was a different planet. It was a different life. How did people manage to survive? The answer, first of all, is most didn't. Which, when I try to imagine myself, God forbid, in such a situation, I think I might last a day. I think then I'd be broken. But let's talk about the ones who are really strong. Most of them don't survive because they're physically very weak. They die of disease, they die of starvation, they die because an SS man has a bad mood and just beats that person to death or shoots them for one reason or another. So the odds are just so much against survival. But what are the things that can help increase the odds of survival? We've mentioned a few already. Where you worked. If you worked indoors as opposed to outdoors. If you worked in the kitchen or in Canada, your chances of survival increased. Although again, on a whim, you could have all of the things we're going to mention now and be killed in an instant for seemingly no reason. But here in the barracks, I'd like to talk about some of the other things that helped those who survived to continue. If you had someone close to you, together with you. If you had a sister or a brother or a father or a son or a close friend or a cousin, if you weren't totally anonymous, because if you had someone here whom you cared about, it meant that there would come a time when that person would go out of their way to help you. It meant that that person would probably need your help, and that was a reason to live too. To help your sister survive, to help your cousin survive, to help your close friend survive, or your father or your son. That was a reason to live. If you were alone here, if you didn't have someone close to you, your chances of survival were much less. And there were those for whom religion was an aid to their survival. And I want to preface everything I'm going to say by saying many people lost their faith. But for some people, the bit of religious ritual they could hold on to helped boost their morale, helped give them a sense of normalcy. So I don't mean to say by this, please don't get me wrong, that the inmates here were all religious. Adarabba. We've been talking about how the Jews of Poland, the Jews living in the Western countries, certainly, many of them were no longer observant. And we know that many people lost their faith here. But it is truly remarkable that some people also were able to find a way to still connect and to be strengthened by their religious faith as well. Some people. This is our last stop in Birkenau. This was an area of latrines. And there's a book by Terence Dupre called The Survivor, written, I believe, in the 60s or 70s, in which he has a chapter called Excremental Assault. And I'd like to read to you a few excerpts. It began in the trains, in the locked boxcars, 80 to 100 people per car, crossing Europe to the camps in Poland. The temperature started to rise as the car was enclosed and body heat had no outlet. The only place to urinate was through a slot, though whoever tried this usually missed, spilling urine on the floor. When dawn finally rose, we were all quite ill and shattered, crushed, not only by the weight of fatigue, but by the stifling moist atmosphere and the foul odor of excrement. There was no latrine, no provision. On top of everything else, a lot of people had vomited on the floor. We were to live for days on end, breathing these foul smells, and soon we lived in the foulness itself. And a testimony from a survivor by the name of Unsdorfer. The new prisoner's initiation into camp life was complete when he realized that there was no toilet paper in the whole of Auschwitz, and I'd have to find my own way out. I tore off a piece of my scarf and washed it after use. I retained this little piece throughout my days in Auschwitz. Others did likewise. Another survivor by the name of Morel writes, "Imagine what it would be like to be forbidden to go to the toilet. Imagine also you are suffering from increasingly severe dysentery." Dysentery is very severe diarrhea, caused and aggravated by a diet of cabbage soup as well as by the constant cold. Naturally, you would try to go anyway. Sometimes you might succeed, but your absences might be noticed and you would be beaten, knocked down. By now, you would know what the risks were, but urgency would oblige you to repeat the attempt, cost what it might. I soon learned to deal with dysentery by tying strings around the lower end of my underwear. And a survivor of Buchenwald by the name of Weinstock writes, "In Buchenwald, it was a principle to depress the morale of the prisoners to the lowest possible level, thereby preventing the development of fellow feeling or cooperation among the victims. How much self-esteem can one maintain? How readily can one respond with respect to the needs of another if both stink, if both are caked with mud and feces? We tend to forget how camp prisoners looked and smelled." I've said from the beginning that the war against the Jews was not only physical but psychological. And what could be more humiliating, what could be more debasing than the excremental assault that Terence Dupre describes? I mentioned that my father-in-law was in a number of camps. He called them his universities. And when my wife and I were newlyweds, we decided to backpack through Europe. And a friend of ours gave us the idea to visit Dachau, one of the camps in which he was a prisoner. We decided to do it on Tisha B'Av. And we went to Dachau and we took pictures and we left before nightfall. We came home, we showed our parents and my in-laws, we showed them photographs of our trip. When we came to the pictures of Dachau, we showed them to my father-in-law, and he looked at a picture that looked very much like this. And he looked up and he laughed. And then he said, "Boy, they sure cleaned that place up." We're seeing a very sanitized version of what once was.
I'm a very tired, old and worn out man, and my eyes have long been blind. Most things that people say to me just seem to slip my mind. Oh, but the suffering and painful times that were in years long gone are still as clear upon my memory as the numbers on my arm. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? Who will stand before the world knowing what to say when the very last survivor fades away? When I hold my grandson close to me and his fingers trace the pattern of my tears, he asks me, "Grandpa, tell me, why do you cry? What is it that you fear?" And I tell him there once was another child who smelled as sweet and felt this warm, but he was taken from before my eyes, and only I remain to mourn. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? And who will stand before a world that now wishes to deny? Or will they believe in someone who never heard the cries? Say or do to make things change. Time has a way of passing by so fast, and like a fleeting shadow, no one will recall the faces of the past. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scare?
The most amazing part about us being here in the last 3.5 hours is that everybody else we spoke about went in this way, and that we get to go out this way. We get to walk out with freedom and with pride, continue to live our lives. The sound of the shofar is the sound of freedom. It's the sound of dror. We're going to leave here with the sound of the shofar in our ears. The sound of shofar is also the sound of Elo Shel Yitzchak. It's the sound of Akedah. It's the sound of sacrifice. The shofar is also the sound of crying, of weeping. And we can still hear those cries, even though there's no one left here. And finally, the sound of the shofar is the sound of tefillah. It's our prayers, it's the tool that brings our prayers close to the Kisei HaKavod. I'm going to ask you as I blow the shofar to just close your eyes, think about your deepest tefillos, your reflections on this trip, your reflections and your hopes and your desires for yourselves, for your families, for Am Yisrael as we leave this horrible place and we continue on to our freedom.
Very hard to summarize your feelings after a day like this. You feel like you've entered the gates of hell. You've seen just unexplainable human depravity, and no one's going to remember what we say here, but hopefully forever people will see this place and what was perpetrated here, and people won't acquiesce in the face of evil again after seeing Auschwitz, Birkenau. Never to allow such human depravity, whether it's against Jews or any other person on the face of this earth, then this trip for me will be worthwhile.
What will become